The Muggle Death Eater and His Daughter by Great 78. Chapter 13. Shovel and Shear. A Thursday evening in late September, 1995. Peter was tired, hot, and sweaty. He wanted a cold shandy, a shower, a shag, and a kip, in that order. Unfortunately for him, his time was not his own.
"Just a bit further, Wormtail. I'm sure we'll find it soon."
It had been the Dark Lord's command that the bones of his Muggle father needed to be properly exhumed, rather than summoned by magic. He had some long and rambling explanation as to why this was, something about tainting the spirit of magic with the filthiness of Muggle biological matter, but Peter had given up listening to the explanation a long time ago. The short of it was that Peter was standing with a shovel 4 feet below the surface of the ground, wearing a baby carrier backpack on his back, which held the world's ugliest and scariest-looking baby. And he was digging. And digging. And digging. They had started at sundown, hoping not to be noticed by the villagers of Little Hangleton. Peter had cast a notice-me-not charm, but he wasn't sure if it was strong enough. More than one curious stray cat had stopped to watch his progress. Cats made him nervous. Every time one arrived, he would shoo it away with his shovel. The cats would hiss and swipe at the shovel, move back a foot or two, then stop and turn brazenly, settling themselves to watch once more. Peter shovelled out yet another spade full of dirt, and dug the blade back in, stepping on the edge of it so that it might bite further into the earth. It hit something solid.
"That's it, Wormtail. You've found it."
Peter allowed himself only a moment to rest on the handle of the shovel before resuming. Yes, he had found it, but he still needed to uncover it. "4 hours later, he staggered into the kitchen of the Riddle house, lurching achefully towards the sink. He dropped the baby carrier backpack as gently as he could. He was deeply tired, long past the desire for the shandy and the shower and the shag. He cupped his hands under the sink tap and gulped the sweet, almost mossy-flavoured water from the bowl formed by his dirty palms. When his stomach was swollen and gurgling with the water, he stopped drinking, turned off the water tap, and slumped down to his knees on the floor. He eyed the square yellow tiles lovingly. Here looked like as good a place as any to rest his head. He lay face down on the floor, the cool tile caressing his cheek like a lover's hand. The last thing he saw before closing his eyes was the skittering, atrocious baby urchin propelling itself across the floor. It half crawled, half dragged itself from the room towards its bed.
"Well done, Wormtail. Rest."
The Rat Man would need a few hours of sleep. The Dark Lord did not begrudge him that, even though he was impatient. It was September already, and time was wasting away. He crawled back to the side of the large 4-poster bed that he shared with Nagini. She was coiled loosely upon the bed, the perfect size for him to nest in the midst of her coils. He climbed gratefully against her, settling against her cool, dry skin. Her head raised slightly, and one eye opened to take him in. "I've missed you," her eyes seemed to say. Her forked tongue darted out, licking a bit of dirt away from his shoulder. He closed his eyes and let her. When she was satisfied that he was clean, she rested her head against his stomach and slept again. There would be time for the spell. Tomorrow, perhaps. For now, the 3 inhabitants of the Riddle house slumbered peacefully.
"Get up!"
The time for rest was over. He was ready to claim his body again. He pushed his wand into Wormtail's neck. Well, it wasn't his wand. Not exactly. As they had slithered northward on their return to England from Albania, he and Nagini had passed through several lands. First were several smaller countries that used to not be individual countries at all. Next, a corner of Italy, then Switzerland. Here they turned northwards and west, cutting a swath across France. All of their movement was done at night. They slept during the day. As they slithered, Nagini would occasionally feel talkative and share a bit of what she had learned in her time alone. There had been more wars, of course, hence the reason for multiple countries, rather than just the one of Yugoslavia. America had elected an actor as its leader, and he had somehow convinced almost the entirety of Eastern and Western Europe to be civil to each other. How quaint! Now they had arrived in a town in France, where they would take something that Nagini called the Channel. It sounded remarkable and vaguely dangerous, until Voldemort realized that it was simply a tunnel under the English Channel. Well, this was a nice bit of innovation. When he returned to power and controlled all manner of magical creatures, this channel would be useful in his bid for taking over the European continent for those who could not apparate. He wondered if the American actor had also built a tunnel from England to America. As they passed through the underbelly of the channel, the chunderbelly? Voldemort thought wildly. His eye caught on something lying on the ground. "Go back!" he whispered to the faithful Nagini. She turned and slithered back the way they had come. "There! To the left! Here! Stop!" The snake halted, waiting beside the pile of debris. With a trembling, fledgling hand that barely looked like a hand, Voldemort stretched carefully towards the object. It was perfect, entirely smooth and unblemished. Bold stripes of red and yellow ran down its length, segmenting the stark white of it. As he picked it up, he was pleased to feel the lightness of it. Rather than the heft of a solid twig like a wand, this one was nearly as light as air. He saw upon inspection that the reason for this was that it was filled with air, hollow, open at each end. He waved the object carefully, performing the last spell that he had done. Avada Kedavra. "Yes, this will do wonderfully." Until such time as he had his own body and his own wand back, this wand would fit well in his hand, work perfectly for his needs. Nagini whispered a name, an origin for the spectacular wand in his hand. He smiled to himself. Of course. It was a stalwart Scottish name, no doubt from a rich, ancient herald filled with noble ancestry. Perhaps when he restyled himself, in a few years he would adopt this name as his own, leaving behind all traces of Riddle and Gaunt. As it was, he had had a bugger of a time coming up with Lord Voldemort. 13-year-old him was adamant that Tom Marvolo Riddle had to have an anagram suitable for a powerful, dark overlord. It had taken him the better part of a year to come up with the best option. Immortal Dove Lord was immediately rejected. He had no desire to use the dove as his symbol. Immoral Voted Lord also sounded strange. Rival Molded Motor sounded vaguely mechanical and was rejected. Lord Moled Vomit was amusing to his 13-year-old self, but he knew it would ultimately send the wrong message. What was he, a dentist? One that he considered briefly
but was rejected was Mr. Tom, a dildo lover. But he did not want to include any references to Tom, his Muggle father's name. And whilst a dildo wasn't a thing as far as he knew, who was to say it didn't mean something to someone somewhere? I am Lord Voldemort was by far the best option. And it was time for Lord Voldemort's return. Peter wasn't moving. Voldemort pushed the wand in harder, and the plump, balding man began to stir. Peter cracked one eye and flinched. The creepy little creature formerly known as Voldemort was back, barely 3 hours after he'd left Peter to die here on this kitchen floor. Voldemort was pushing the McDonald's straw into his neck. The Dark Lord was very protective of this straw, and wielded it imperiously, as though it were a wand or a scepter. It would have been amusing, except for the nightmarishly haunting appearance of the man in his current state. Peter pushed himself up first to his hands and knees, then to his feet. Apparently it was time for the magic. He had been dreading it, but on the other hand, well, at least he had the other hand, he thought. He picked up Voldemort and grabbed the supplies he had been amassing for the last few weeks. Several varieties of herbs, stolen from neighbors' flower pots, dandelion weeds from the garden, unicorn blood from a wizarding apothecary, 2 mandrake plants which had been maturing in the kitchen window-sill, along with earmuffs for them both, black pepper from the Muggle grocer, venom extracted from Nagini earlier that week, the blood of the enemy forcibly taken from Aberforth, the bone of the father unknowingly given by the grave Peter had just dug up, and a knife for the willing sacrifice. They made their way to the downstairs toilet, where the bathtub had been washed in preparation for this moment. Peter turned on the hot water tap, waiting until the basin was about a third full. He tested the water's temperature before reaching for his master. He placed the creature thing inside the water gently, then began adding the ingredients, stirring meticulously after each addition. Finally, it was time for the final 3 ingredients. He poured the blood in and said the incantation. The water, which had been a dull grey, turned red. He added the bone, including the incantation as he did so, and the water turned blue. He picked up the knife in his left hand, taking several fast breaths in an effort to steady himself. "Do it!" Voldemort commanded, and Peter shut his eyes tight, pressing the blade to his right forearm as hard as he could. In a minute it was over. The water turned white and began frothing and bubbling. Peter looked away, crouching to the ground, consumed in his own acute pain and grief. He gathered up a swath of robe and wrapped it around the stump of his hand. The ache in his arm was intense, but he knew it would pass. Instead, he was left with the misery of knowing that from now on he could never tug on his erection and cup his balls at the same time. He would never start a round of applause or play the cymbals again. And he would have to learn to write and cast spells with his left hand. The bubbling bathtub was reaching a frothing point. The mist above it began to dissipate. From its depths, a shadow began to emerge, which solidified into a figure. A man began to stand in the center of the bathtub. No longer the mottled, angry red of newly formed skin. Now Voldemort's pallor was the dark grey of a snake nearing its shed. He had no nose. Apparently they had missed an ingredient. The feather of a toucan, perhaps. Peter thought wildly, and tried not to laugh as his body entered shock. Voldemort's mouth was a straight, colourless gash, and he had no hair. But his eyes... Peter looked at them once, and it was enough. He didn't wish to do it again. They glowed red,
the blistering red of a Muggle fire engine. A warning. He was back. He felt glorious. The whimpering, crying man on the ground cowered before him in his rightful place at last. "Wormtail," he said, "robe me." Wormtail pushed himself up from the ground gracelessly, overbalanced on his left side. He took a long wizard's robe from a hook on the back of the door, trying to hold it in a way that would not get his blood on it. Awkwardly, he held it out for the taller man to put on. "Your arm, Wormtail," Voldemort said. Suddenly, Peter was overcome with relief. Voldemort had mentioned it vaguely, of course, that with his renewed powers he would provide Peter with an acceptable substitute, but in his past experiences the Dark Lord had not been one to appease his inferiors so quickly. In gratitude, he held out his bloodied stump. "Your other arm, Wormtail." Oh. Well, that was quite different. Voldemort extended a long, pale finger and pressed it firmly upon the dark mark on Peter's arm. The mark had begun changing months ago, likely correlating to the Dark Lord's awakening and increased strength. Voldemort looked at Peter. Peter looked at the floor. "We should move into the living room," Voldemort said. "I feel that the toilet will not be large enough to hold us all." Peter nodded gravely, and reached with his left hand into the bathtub to pull the chain for the drain stopper. Lucius awoke from a post-dinner nap on the sofa in his study. The mark on his arm, which had been changing and itching for months, was inflamed, an angry, burning red, a beacon. He sat up quickly in fear. The thing that he had been dreading. It was happening then. The time had come. Voldemort had returned. Lucius was afraid of the wrath of his former master. Did Voldemort know what had happened? Who had divulged what to Ministry officials? Was he going to be facing the gallows, or would he be received with open arms? And would those open arms wield a wand bent on vengeance? Then, like a shelter in a hailstorm, he remembered his trump card. Lucius, above all others, had been welcoming to Voldemort's most trusted secret agent. He had opened his home to him. He had offered his son's protection for that man's daughter. Richard was his ticket to being in Voldemort's good graces again. He stood and disapparated. Thank you for listening to this chapter of The Muggle Death Eater by Great 78.